Welcome to the CAS-E podcast, The Resilience of Magic in Modernity, Part 3.
So we could see this in a way as a resilience factor. The whole field of art in all its variations, film, literature, novels, maybe today also computer games, they they are basically a domain for where magic can always continue, even if there is a large secular pressure around, or there's a negative cultural atmosphere. Art will always or will be a resilience factor for these practices. Um, but if we think about disenchantment and secularization a bit more, Marco, how would be your take on these two terms, and how do we interpret that today after it has been much discussed whether it happened at all vis-a-vis resilience? So
Yes.
how would you interpret that?
Well, first of all, I have some ideas about why magic is resilient, and maybe I can or we can get back to this later, especially when we talk about the future. Maybe that's something that I would like to expand on later. But first of all, I would like to say that when we are talking about resilience with respect to magic, maybe it's not even the right term because resilience means something that uh, resists an attempt at suppression. So, something that is being threatened and yet manages to survive. Um, Now, I think that what we are seeing with magic in contemporary societies is something else because I think there is a very clear cultural success of magic. So it's not about survival, actually, but it's about how magic has become very, very popular, which is something else. It's more than just resilience. And we should also maybe reflect on the reasons why not only it has managed to survive, but it has also become immensely popular. So that's one thing. And I think that a factor that we should consider, it's not so much an internal one, so how magic functions. And on this, I would have some ideas that we can return to later, but also the external factors, because obviously, for a long time, mainstream culture, in whichever form we could have encountered it, was an enemy to magic. So consider magic to be something negative, and so it wanted magic to disappear. Um, but if we look at post World War II culture, we can see that the situation has changed dramatically. So, on the one hand, we have religious institutions which for centuries have been the enemies of magic, which have lost much of their grip on societies. And that's the factor of secularization. So, when we talk about secularization, it's not the same thing as disenchantment. Secularization, I think, it's more of a social factor, which is also about the loss of social control that religious institutions, mainstream religious institutions, have on societies. So obviously, when this kind of opposition shrinks, is being reduced, then there is more space for things like magic. That's one thing. The other big enemy traditionally is science. And it's clear that World War II, especially, um, challenged also the social capital that science had. When we think about the Shoah, when we think about Hiroshima. So it's clear that what we see there and what people saw there is the use of technology. It's also the use of science not to make the life of people better, but to destroy life. And I think this affected also science, or rather the image that science had in society enormously. And at the same time, in science itself, in the development of science, you could see that rationality was being challenged, also from a theoretical point of view. The conversation that at some point took place between Carl Gustav Jung and Wolfgang Pauli about synchronicity shows that at some point within science itself, in modern physics, old positivist ideas about the Newtonian universe didn't hold anymore. So there again, there was a kind of retreat of science from rationality, which was the big argument against magic, which also created space for magic. So it's not so much about how magic was able to resist this pressure, but also how the pressure itself at some point seemed to be reduced. In fact.
Yeah. And at the same time, many modern practitioners, you mentioned the example of Carl Gustav Jung and Pauli and their discussion about synchronicity, which fell into a phase where quantum mechanics have kicked in. And also many practitioners jumped on the board of this discourse, if you like. So chaos magic emerged in the 1970s.
Absolutely.
And we could call this also a strategic alliance with science. So magic kind of formed alliances or engaged in what we could call scientifications, which clearly happened in the case of chaos magic. And also various studies show that many modern practitioners, they are not at all distant from science. It is just one type of rationality, one way of interpreting the world. And here I think I would like to ask you, Andrea, because you are in touch with many practitioners, and many actually have university degrees or are also used to scientific arguments. How do these people interpret their practice from this particular viewpoint? How do they scientificate magic?
First of all, I would like to say that if the scientification of magic started as a reaction to the rise of positivism, as in French occultism, for instance, the relationship between science and magic is not just one of opposition. Indeed, scholars have highlighted, for instance, the selective history of Western scientific thought, noting that many key figures associated with the scientific revolution, such as Isaac Newton or Marie Curie, were also deeply engaged with esotericism. For instance, Isaac Newton was not only a physicist, but also an alchemist. And overlaps between scientific and magical or esoteric epistemic registers can be identified, such as the shared empiricism found both in alchemy and modern science. Therefore, I believe that the relationship between magic and science is complex, and that interpreting it only as an opposition might be part of the whole myth of disenchantment. This said, I agree with Marco that the question of the relationship between magic and science should be analyzed through the study of the evolution of scientific thought throughout the 20th century, in the light of the tragical historical events that Marco has mentioned and which have changed the perspective on science, but also in the light of the impact that discoveries in the field of physics, for instance, have had on the philosophy of science. For instance, contemporary physicists and philosophers of science, like French astrophysicist Aurélien Barraud, call for a more modest approach to science and scientific inquiry, reminding us that as a symbolic system, science does not grant a direct and unequivocal access to the truth of reality, offering only an approximation of reality. Barraud claims that the dichotomy between belief and knowledge is often too naive or overly simplistic, and this shift in the approach to hard sciences, which started in the second half of the 20th century, but which has developed even more in recent times as a reaction to the growing culture of techno-solutionism, facilitates the coexistence of different rationalities, including the magical one. Regarding contemporary practitioners, as you mentioned, Bern, many of them are indeed academically inclined, hold academic degrees, or even work in the field of science. What we noticed is the coexistence of scientific and magical worldviews at the level of the individual consciousness, And I believe that this capacity to navigate seemingly contradictory discourses and rationalities might be one of the defining features of secular societies, as argued by sociologist Peter Berger. Thus, the question of resilience must differentiate between the societal level and individual consciousness, and also take into account that the process of secularization includes also the forces of counter-secularization. Regarding the question of scientification, what I have noticed is that practitioners study scientific theories, for instance, in the fields of quantum physics or evolutionary psychology, to provide an explanation to their magical models of reality and their experiences. This could be seen as an attempt to legitimize their magical practices, but I believe that it has more to do with a genuine interest to understand reality. Indeed, their magical experiences and experiential insights contrast with the conventional perspectives of reality that they were taught in school, and which are unfortunately not necessarily aligned with the latest scientific theories. So paradoxically, the engagement in magic seems to spark also an interest in cutting-edge scientific research. This said, scientification is not the only approach contemporary magic practitioners have towards science. Indeed, we find also re-enchantment discourses where magic is intertwined with frustration with the secular world and with the hegemony of scientific culture, and becomes a political tool. In this context, magic is employed as a means to reject secular worldviews, embracing instead a more primal or shamanistic approach that deliberately excludes the scientific framework in favor of a more experiential and intuitive form of spirituality. So we find both discourses that include the scientific and those that reject it, which shows that different strategies are in play to cope with a scientific and technological culture.
So I think now we have arrived at an aspect of magic, if you like, that we haven't really touched upon yet, namely its efficacy, its perceived efficacy among practitioners, which may be a resilience factor in itself. So obviously, magic persists because people have experiences of success, not only today, but maybe since centuries. And obviously, that's a tricky aspect because today practitioners, they may even be academics like you, Judith. So you're trained in scientific discourse and evidence-based arguments, but at the same time, you're a practitioner. And I presume that you are also looking for evidence and effects in your practice. So how do you unite these things in your own work?
There's a huge kind of lifetime question. I think when you talk about efficacy, one of the things that you have to factor into this is what outcome people are looking for. And I think if you are practicing what you might call spellcraft or results-based magic on a very popular level, I think that's really difficult. Although it's what people love to do, and I will engage with people all the time who will be absolutely clear that they passed their driving test because of the ritual they did 2 days before. This is not something that you could use evidence-based arguments to prove or disprove. I think what I'm much more interested in from my own perspective is magic as a transformational practice, as a practice of changing the self. And I think on that level, of course, it's a subjective process, but what you do is you analyze the results of the process in your own life as you grow and change. I've stuck with it for a very, very long time because I'm incredibly ancient. So I've stuck with it for between 40 and 50 years. And it in my own life as a tool of transformation, it's worked. And I suppose the other thing to say about that is this practice that we're talking about, I think, as Marco's answer to the last question alluded to, crosses over so many boundaries. And one of the really important ones of those for me has always been it takes away the split between the mind and the body. So in magical practice, the that practice is experiential and embodied. It's not just an intellectual pursuit. It's something that is, you might say, in witchcraft, you feel with the mind and think with the body, and those distinctions fall away. So it's in that kind of practice that I find a really rich and fulfilling way of living my life, I suppose, if that's a kind of an answer.
Yeah. So when you say it worked, you're probably referring to experiences of transformation.
Yeah,
then?
yeah. I'm probably not referring to something as simple as I passed my driving test or the job interview was a success and all those things that people often like to cite. But the
Although
change
that's also kind of transformation.
it
no?
is, but what I was going to say is that what is it that not the conduct of the job interview itself, but what is it that makes me and myself able to handle that interview and come across as the person that they want to employ? And I think my magical take on life is probably a part of that, but it's definitely that magic for transformation rather than kind of physical out there results that interest me.
Yeah. This reminds me of the work of Tanja Luhrmann, who is an anthropologist, and she did a quite famous field work that has been published in 1998 as Persuasions of the Witchcraft.
I know it well.
And her main argument is that practitioners, they undergo an interpretive drift through practice. Over time, they begin selectively interpreting the events that happen to them in favor of retrospectively ascribing the experiences to the practice of the rituals. And I've always found that quite unsatisfying, because the practitioners that I know, they would not easily want to trick themselves into this kind of positive thinking.
Absolutely.
Well,
It will probably play a role to a certain degree, but I know practitioners who are very keen on really noting down real effects in ritual diaries, very systematically trying to reduce so-called error signals or factors that may have affected the ritual in different ways, and trying to improve their efficacy rate over time, if you like. So I wonder, Andrea, again, because I know that yesterday there was an Ask a Practitioner event on the RENCEP website with a well-known Bardon practitioner of the work of Franz Bardon. And the Bardonists, they are extremely results-oriented. So they really want to measure the effects of their practices in a very straightforward physical way. So what was your impression of that practitioner, and how do you interpret this very results-oriented modern magical practice, Andrea?
Yes, before answering your question, I think that Franz Bardon is a very interesting practitioner for our conversation, because he was a practitioner of magic, but also a stage magician and a physician. So he embodies different dimensions that we have touched upon in our discussion. His book, Initiation into Hermetics, is structured as a 10-step initiation process. Each step or chapter includes a series of mental, astral, and physical exercises, along with various tests that the practitioner must pass before progressing to the next stage. Some of these tests require, for instance, the ability to hold a mental representation for a specific amount of time without interruption, while others involve the physical manifestation of magical powers. For instance, to demonstrate mastery over the 4 elements, so fire, water, air, and earth, the practitioner must project one of these elements into a glass of water and then use litmus paper to determine whether the pH of the water has changed after the practice. The active elements, like fire and air, should produce an acidic reaction, while the passive ones, water and earth, should yield an alkaline reaction. As you have mentioned, Bernd, yesterday we had a Ask a Practitioner event. We invited an experienced Bardonist to engage with the RENCEP community. So this practitioner has practiced Bardon's system for more than 30 years, committing at least 2 hours per day to his magical practice and undergoing the various tests proposed in Bardon's teachings. He mentioned the efficacy of Bardon's system, and he highlighted the concrete results of his practices as the main source of motivation behind his long-standing dedication to magic. I believe that the empirical observations involved in Bardon's system must be interpreted in the light of the intersection between scientific and magical epistemic registers, which I have touched upon previously already, particularly in terms of empirical observation and the verification of magical practices, of the effect of magical practices on physical reality. Similar tests to those proposed by Bardon can be found, for instance, in older traditions and in different cultural and religious contexts, such as in the 6 dharmas of Naropa. So this is a set of advanced practices attributed to the Indian Buddhist Mahasiddha Naropa, who lived in the 11th century. And in particular in the practice of Tumon, which involves the generation of an inner heat, there are tests that require practitioners to dry wet towels on their naked bodies in sub-zero Himalayan temperatures. In relation to our discussion on resilience, these examples illustrate that the quest for observable and verifiable efficacy is fundamental to certain magical practices and for certain practitioners, transcending the dimension of personal beliefs. This approach to magic also presents an opportunity for scientific research to explore the effects of magical practices in controlled laboratory settings, allowing for a more thorough assessment of their reality.
So I think with this focus on efficacy, we are more or less at the end of the podcast. I would like to ask everyone for a brief statement concerning the future of magic and maybe esoteric practices on a larger scale. So I personally think we live in very interesting times. Things have shifted during our lifetime. Magic has become a positive thing for many or even the majority of people. It is very positively connotated in popular culture. It's a buzzword in advertisements. We have the Marvel Cinematic Universe, which is maybe the most impressive entertainment thing that has ever been there, with I think over 40 movies, and it's essentially about people transgressing the boundaries of what humans are capable of. So it's again the magician.
I was already there as a teenager with the comics. Even before it became.
I think it's again the magician in a different variant. So it's people who have superpowers who overcome the boundaries of human capacities, at least how we're used to these. And I think this will likely continue and become more. I'm not sure how, but I don't know what are your takes on this question of the future of magic.
Well, part of me thinks, who am I to comment on the future of magic when it's obviously has its own life and will go the way it wants to go. But what I would say in terms of the people practicing it and the people in their teens and their 20s that I work with who are coming through with a new approach to it is that there's a current in magic which is absolutely inextricably bound up with the climate emergency and therefore with a concern with moving away from the anthropocentric and putting the more than human at the center of your practice, a magic which is at the same one and the same time earth-centered but also animist, very profoundly animist in a very good way. And I find that current really, really interesting. I'm glad to be engaging with it and becoming part of it.
Yeah, that's very interesting. Climate change as a catalyst for a new magical interest in a relational interpretation of life and what is around us. Marco, do you have anything to add?
Yeah, I think magic has a bright future, in my view, and the practices and the beliefs that we associate with magic here in our discourse certainly have a bright future. I think they will never die. They have been around for thousands and thousands of years. And I don't think they will ever die because they relate very, very deeply to fundamental existential situations in which most human beings are involved at one point or another. So there is an emotional, affective element in magic that I think is also the key to its resilience, if we want to call it that way.
Yeah.
So things related to, for instance, relationships with other persons, love, sometimes hate, also material subsistence, money, these kind of things. But also the desire to improve yourself, to become a better person. And so this can be related in some cases also to philosophy, to psychology. So they also offer some answers to that. But magic also has its own special answers to these kind of questions and these kind of urges that people have sometimes. So I think these things will never die because clearly magic seems to offer tools for solving these problems that other areas of human culture doesn't seem to have. Whether these things will continue to be called magic in the future, that's the question. Because at this moment, magic as a term, as a word, has a positive connotation. That's a new thing, a relatively recent thing. Whether this will continue to be so in the future, also from a global perspective, well, this is something that we cannot know because languages change, so other terms can be found in the future. So it's more maybe a distinction between the actual thing, so what people do in certain situations, than how this thing is going to be called.
So it's intimately bound to the human condition, and which is again a resilience factor,
Absolutely.
we could say.
Human condition is a good way to
Yes.
put it. Yeah.
Now, Andrea, finally, as the co-founder of a charity that wants to further the study of magic and esotericism, what is your take on the future of magic?
When we consider magic in a broad sense, including also non-Western traditions, it becomes clear that the practices associated with this term can be found in many cultural and religious contexts, and they have persisted for thousands of years. So the idea that magic might disappear or decline due to the dominance of scientific and technological thought seems a bit naive to me. Disenchantment, after all, is largely a myth, and secularization doesn't necessarily equate to a decline in religiosity or its significance. I believe it's more reasonable to view magic as a gateway to certain experiences that fulfill essential human needs that science is not designed to address. With that in mind, I believe that the future of magic is quite promising.
So, with these words said, I would like to thank you all for being here, Judith Noble, Marco Pasi, Andrea Centore. It was a pleasure to have this discussion with you, and I look forward to future podcasts in our series from the Center for Advanced Studies in Erlangen. Thank you for listening.
Thank you, Bernd. It
Thank
was a
you,
pleasure
Bernd.
to be here.
Thank you.